we're running slightly late, so I'm gonna maybe go faster through this presentation I normally would. To introduce myself, my name's Dave Haynes. I work at HTC and I run ViveX and the developer ecosystem across EMEA, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about that to give you some context. So hands up in the room. Actually, first of all, hands up in the room if you're a founder. Okay, well done. Thank you. We applaud all of you. Hands up if, in the room if you're a developer. Hands up in the room if you're an investor. All right, everybody check those guys out. Okay, and hands up if you've eaten too much schnitzel in the last 2 days. Okay, right, good stuff. Let's start. So yeah, just to give you some context, so what I do is we run a program called ViveX at HTC. Started back in 2016 as a kind of headline $100 million fund to invest in the space. Why do we do that? It's not just selfishly for ourselves, but it's also, everyone in this room is really instrumental to growing the whole ecosystem. This is about lifting, rising tides lift all boats. So, we do invest in content through things like Vive Studios and Vive Arts, but really we want to invest in startups because it's you guys that are going to build the infrastructure that everybody needs to build on. And we help those companies by investing, but it's also not just about the cash, it's also about helping you guys, connecting you to network, helping you with the resource that we have to hand at HTC. I run the London office now. London is all of Europe. I know that might not be the case in a couple of days' time, but that's I truly am European, and it's very important to us. But I also have colleagues, ViveX colleagues around the globe. So if any of you are kind of in from other cities, I'm happy to route you through to my colleagues in those places. And we're now the most active investor in XR and continue to be, and hopefully we will do that with a very rare, a very varied portfolio that we've had across the years. A lot of people ask, what stage do we invest? Well, we write 150K, up to 150K checks. We're usually doing that as either the first money in or as part of a seed round. But, as the ecosystem matures, our kind of investment thesis also matures. So we're investing in maybe slightly later stage companies. So even if you're raising a Series A, then as long as we can provide some value above and beyond our cash, then it's of interest. And what's our investment thesis? Well, it's very broad, and I'm going to speak a bit more about this and what we think other investors are looking for. But, we really think about the term Vive reality, which internally for us means the convergence of all these amazing technologies. So yes, we have invested mostly in VR, but we're also looking at AR and enabling technology around it, whether it's 5G, AI. We've even done a couple of brain-computer interface companies. So, it's the whole gamut of technologies around the immersive space. Cool, but what I want to talk about today is, and I noticed one of the startups have a slide that says VR is dead in it. And I think the challenge with us showing slides saying VR is dead, that actually that's really the sentiment that's that if you go and speak to investors, they've kind of got this lingering, right, they know that things have been slower than everybody predicted. And it concerns them. So, this is something that I concern myself about. Part of my job is really to go and convince other investors that they should be investing in you guys as well. So, a lot of the time it's presenting arguments of like, okay, well, no, 2016 was too early, but now's the right time. And why do I think that we can say that winter is done? Certainly from an investor perspective, I think we all believe that, but investors don't. Well, the first is market timing. So the big problem that investors have, they have to be on the cusp of new technologies, but it's a really fine balance of kind of getting ahead of the wave and then just being too early. And the cliche in investment terms is, being early is often as good as being wrong. So, we saw in 2015, 2016, a lot of excitement into space, a lot of capital coming in. If I'd been given this talk in 2016, I would have had all these charts of, oh, look at the investment that's growing. We've invested $2 billion into this space. And there was a lot of hype. But I think, now, unfortunately, we do have this perception. But, my message to investors is now really is the best time. So the VR market and the AR market, they're certainly not mature. But if you're an investor, you're thinking for the next 18 months, you're probably funding that company for the next 12 months, then expecting them to go and raise again. And I think we can all agree in this room, over the next 18 months, there's still, a lot to be done. But, the market really is ready. And I would kind of urge any investor to start looking quite actively at this space. Now, I would say, I'm going to talk a lot about VR in this presentation, but just a quick kind of, asterisk on AR. I think it's interesting because, there is still that hype around AR. People are thinking about mobile mobile AR, which I'll talk about in a minute. But again, I think the market is timed slightly differently to VR as well. So again, that's something, if you're pitching an AR company versus a VR, you're probably changing the story a little bit for the investor you're talking to. Next big reason why I think winter is done. Next generation is here. I'll talk about this a bit more, but we've seen a lot of experimentation on the hardware side, but we're now really pushing forward, both with the new generation, but also a glimpse at what's coming after that. And then lastly, this is what investors, they're not doing this for charity. It's really important to them that there is some type of business there and that they can make the business case to their partners. And I think now is actually a really exciting time, because you can walk confidently in to a VC meeting, and you can actually not just show all these kind of graphs as what might happen in the future. You can actually show graphs of your traction, your revenue, and how your company is growing. So I expect those cases to be compelling investors, not just on your company, but also what your revenues are doing. Cool. So to look at the market, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, and I could have displayed lots of different graphs, but I think the interesting thing to say is, early on, these graphs were, looking much more kind of accelerated. They were maybe much more exaggerated. What people had done was they'd taken the early market data. The analysts, they like to put out these reports, and they have to tell a good story. So they take data from, Google Cardboard distribution or Samsung Gear sales, which may have been subsidized, and they just kind of extrapolate from that market data. And analysts, they're good at what they do, but they can't see in the future. And I think that was, maybe a kind of misfire for some of the investors who, saw this rapid growth and wanted to get in. But I think now, we're still early. Headset penetration is, still relatively modest, but there's a definite path. And I think you can look at any one of these numbers and say with some confidence that, that feels, you can understand how the analysts have built up those numbers. And I think, we're still at the beginning of that growth curve. So this is a big time, a big opportunity for investors. So I talked about hardware. I think, whether you call it version 1 or version 0.1 or whatever it is, I think it's no coincidence in the last couple of weeks, we saw Oculus, announce, or John Carmack getting on stage and saying, hey, sadly, we're going to be retiring the Samsung Gear. Google announced this week that they were retiring the Daydream. So, for me, that's a really positive sign. Lots of experimentation, get things out into the market, but, those things die out, and then we learn, and then we move on. I think, we're definitely kind of moving past kind of, V1 of VR, and we're kind of moving into the next generation of hardware. So that means, what does that mean? On the one hand side, I think, it's really about this new wave of standalone devices. And there is a proliferation of these. We have the Focus Plus, which is a more enterprise-focused standalone device. We obviously know the Quest is in the market, and this brings a new dynamic. And I think we're only going to see more of that. And I think everybody is placing bets that standalone is going to help drive volume, whether that's into consumers' living room or whether that's into the training rooms of large enterprises. But then also the next generation of PC VR. And we haven't taken massive leaps here, but there's been lots of incremental developments which have led to this new generation. So whether that's better controllers or stripping out different tracking systems, there's a lot of power there still in the high end, and we're seeing better screens and lots of hardware iterations, and that's only going to continue. So yeah, standalone, complete game changer. A lot of these companies in the room, some are training companies, trying to convince a large company to put up lots of base stations, spend lots of money on PCs. It is a barrier to entry. So that's a big question you'll get from investors, is like, oh hey, cool solution, but how does this really scale? Well, now you can point to this and you can make the case. This is the Vive Cosmos, so stripping things out like inside-out tracking. This is great. Now I can, just put this in my bag and I can go and demo to an investor in their room rather than getting them to meet me somewhere I've got my tripods and things like that. So it's just removing friction. And then adding things into what we already have to unlock new use cases that the investors won't even have seen. So things like eye tracking that all of a sudden make some really compelling training cases or and things like that. Now, just to touch a little bit on AR, there's some companies in the room. There's some companies demoing that are still thriving on mobile AR. The way we think about that at Vive is, we are a smartphone company. That does make a lot of sense, but we also see, a big future in headset-driven VR. And again, I think just to talk about timing, it's still early for that. So, as an investor, you're probably thinking, okay, really great use case. When are these devices going to start? Do consumers actually want to wear headset VR? And if so, what's the AR and what's the use case? Or how does that actually get deployed in the enterprise? HTC, we're already kind of doing some of this. We see kind of going from this continuum of going from VR to AR. You can see some guys playing table tennis with the pass-through cameras on the Pro. And certainly in terms of our investment thesis, this is something that we want to look at. We've been, looking at the infrastructure layers that are needed for people to build applications, and then, probably in the next 18 months, it's looking at the applications that sit on top of that, which will work not just on our devices, but across the plethora of different devices that we're seeing in the market. And underpinning all of this, it's a bit of a buzzword. This is actually happening, though. We're rolling out our 5G smart hub in carriers all across Europe, in the US and China. And this is something that's going to be big for enterprise in 2020 as well, as large companies start to get 5G in their campus. And this is actually happening now. And again, it unlocks those use cases. If you think about other big companies, someone like Instagram, that company wouldn't have existed until you had 4G and GPS in every smartphone. So it's a completely new use case that drives huge billion-dollar opportunities. Very solid ecosystem. Our fellow investors at the VR Fund, they put out great maps like this. They've identified over 550 companies that are profitable today and are only going to continue to grow. If I look at where, people were investing, as you're kind of in the installation phase of any technology, the smart investor bets are usually going in the kind of the picks and shovels, the tooling layer that the applications need to be built on. But certainly in our investment thesis, we're still looking at for the next generation, but we're now starting to looking for the killer apps. So you can pick any of those verticals, and you can probably pick 2 or 3 companies that you'd happily sink 10, 15, 20 million into as an investment, because they're going to be the category leaders, and they're going to be big $100 million to billion-dollar companies, we hope, in the future. Right now, where ViveX is looking at, we're still remaining open to kind of all interesting ideas, but I think this is a sentiment, certainly in Europe, where investors are a lot more, maybe cautious of the big consumer bets. A lot of money and VCs are focused on enterprise now, and they're not seeing these as VR companies or AR companies. They're just seeing these as enterprise companies and benchmarking them in the same way. So they need to see revenue, but we're looking for the killer apps in it's the obvious categories: training, design, visualization, collaboration. And the great thing is you can walk into that meeting and you can show the ROI, you can show the revenues. And from everybody's perspective, the really great thing now is your customers are saying it's not like, why are we doing this? It's like, okay, get it. We've seen the data. We understand what the problem is and how you can solve it. But how do we actually deploy this? And I think we're seeing companies doing this in abundance now. Just to pick out some examples, I think the poster child is, the Striver in the US, where capital is maybe a bit more abundant. I think they've raised publicly around $22 million. But these guys have trained 650,000 people now. That's something that any VC should be paying attention to. But here in Europe, we have some amazing companies. InnoActive, who are here on the trade show floor, they've raised publicly 5 million. And I think these guys, it's a very solid. If I'm an investor looking at this business, it's a very solid proposition. And then just to flag a ViveX company that we invested in last year, Immersive Factory. They do health and safety training. They've just gone out to raise a round, whereas maybe 12 months ago they would have struggled to raise that. They're able to raise very easy and have their pick of investors, which is really positive news. I think the next big opportunity is not just in hard skills training, which is probably the first real use cases we're seeing, but it's soft skills. It's a big category. And again, if you're a VC, you're looking for these kind of big scalable opportunities that reach, not just like 650,000 people, but potentially 500 million people. And I think soft skills is something that you can do. You can go in and sell to 50,000 middle managers in a large organization, or it can scale. It's something you can take home and do in your living room. So some interesting companies. Vantage Point, the VR fund invested in last year, focused on anti-sexual harassment training. Fictive Reality, which is a Nordic XR startups, still very early, but they're trying to crack the code for sales training in VR. And then you'll see them later, but a company that we've just backed called Body Swaps, again, trying to figure out how to build a scalable platform. And this is an important thing in training. There's a lot of of companies that look to VCs like service companies. If you're raising money, you don't want to look like a service company, even if that's where you are. You need to look like a scalable platform or a product that could be serving billions of people and earning lots of revenue. Other enterprise cases, I think this is interesting. There's so many opportunities that you can look at. One challenge that these companies will have is they've been able to build early traction, but in enterprise you have a very long sales cycle. So, I've seen companies go out, do kind of, decent sized seed rounds. The challenge is, as they go out to raise their Series A or their Series B, it's like being able to show that you can repeat that, and that there is recurring revenue. So, I know a lot of these companies are on the cusp of raising those larger rounds, and I think, later on this year and probably early next year, we'll see some big announcement that these guys are, raising, decent chunks of money, and I think that will get more investors into the space because, the FOMO sets in again with the investors, and they want to find the same opportunities. What I'm really excited about, though, is if you think about all those examples, they're kind of top down. They're kind of reasons to use VR that you have to be paid for. I'm going into my job and I need to be trained on this. I need to. My boss says I need to improve on that, so I'm going to go and do this VR simulation. What I get excited about is use cases that are more bottoms up, so more productivity driven, where I might actually just choose to do this at home. So if I'm a designer, I'm working in BMW, I want to be doing sketching at home. Well, I can actually go and download a tool like Gravity Sketch, but then I can go and take that into my business, and then it expands from there. So I'm very interested in finding more of these examples, where if you think about the computer revolution, it wasn't until people started bringing their computers home because they realized they could be more productive at work, then all of a sudden there was a big boom in the sector. Cool. So I think I've taken long enough. I want to hand it over to the real stars of today, which is the founders in the room. But just a quick shameless plug. If you are looking for investment, then please come and find me afterwards. The official application deadline was September 30th. But I would love for you to kind of, we're still looking to make 4 or 5 investments here in Europe. So please come and find me or send me a pitch deck. My email is dave_haynes@htc.com.